I used to think silence meant peace. But over time, I learned that silence can be a slow kind of dying, especially when it lives between two people who once swore to love each other. Mornings used to begin with laughter and long conversations over coffee. Now they start with alarms, short nods, and the sound of doors closing. We still share a home, but it feels more like we're tenants of a memory. He talks about work, bills, plans that never include me anymore. I talk less because it no longer changes anything. Some nights, I wait for him to look up from his phone to ask how I am, but his eyes stay on glowing screens, and mine wander toward empty space. I try to remember when the distance began, but it's hard to pinpoint the day love started turning into habit. Maybe it was the day I stopped being heard. Maybe it was the day he stopped noticing the effort I made to be noticed. That he's a good man, I remind myself, but good isn't always enough. I wanted connection, not perfection. I wanted to feel like I mattered, like someone saw me, not just the version of me that cooks, cleans, and remembers his deadlines. I used to leave notes in his lunchbox. He stopped mentioning them. I used to wear the dress he loved. He stopped looking. That kind of silence doesn't break suddenly, it fades quietly, like color from an old photograph. People think infidelity begins with touch, but it doesn't. It begins with neglect, with all the time someone turns away when you're reaching out. One evening at work, I got a message from an old acquaintance, a name that felt strangely alive in my inbox. He asked how I was doing, said it had been too long. I almost ignored it, but curiosity overruled caution. We exchanged polite lines that stretched into long conversations about everything and nothing. He listened. He remembered small things I said. I didn't realize how hungry I'd become for that kind of attention until it was offered so easily. He asked if I wanted to grab a coffee sometime, just to catch up. I told myself it was harmless. Just a conversation. Just one cup. But a part of me knew that saying yes would open a door I wasn't ready to admit existed. That night, as my husband slept beside me, I thought about how wrong it was that a stranger's words could make me feel seen while the man I married barely noticed I was awake. I told myself I was strong enough to ignore the invitation. I told myself I'd delete the message in the morning. But morning came, and I did it. I read it again and again, each time feeling something shift, softly, quietly, dangerously. It wasn't desire yet. It was recognition. It was the reminder that I was still someone worth talking to. And that small thought felt like air after too long underwater. I remember standing by the window that day, watching him rush out to work, not even a glance my way. I could have called out, could have asked for 5 minutes of his time, but what would that change? I'd done it before. He'd smile distractedly, promise to talk later, and later would never come. I was tired of waiting for later. So when my phone buzzed again, with the same gentle invitation, I didn't overthink. I didn't analyze the consequences. I didn't even type a full sentence. I just wrote, sure, why not, and pressed send. It was such a small yes, almost invisible, but it carried everything: loneliness, need, resentment, hope. It was the beginning of something I couldn't yet name. I didn't feel guilty then. I felt awake. Like a part of me that had been sleeping for years had finally opened its eyes. I went about my day pretending it meant nothing, that it was just a friendly coffee, that I could control where it went. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. I knew the silence at home had created an opening, and I had just stepped through it. That night, lying beside a man I no longer recognized, I whispered to myself a truth I didn't dare say out loud. I was ready to feel again, even if it meant breaking something sacred. And when he asked the next day if everything was fine, I smiled and said yes, the same word that had already started to change everything. The first time we met, it felt harmless, ordinary, two people talking about old times over coffee. But beneath every laugh, every shared story, something unfamiliar started to breathe between us. He looked at me the way people do when they actually listen, and I realized how long it had been since someone had. I told myself it was innocent. that I needed this small reminder of what it felt like to be noticed. The way he said my name made it sound lighter, alive. Every word he spoke seemed to fill the silence that had been echoing inside me for years. I didn't plan to see him again, but when he texted later that night, thanking me for the company, I smiled before I could stop myself. I knew I should ignore it. I didn't. I said yes when he asked to talk again, and yes when he asked how I'd been sleeping, and yes when he said he missed our conversations. Each yes was a step, quiet but deliberate, toward something I couldn't admit I wanted. That he never asked about my husband. I never offered. Maybe we both understood the unspoken rule that this connection lived outside the boundaries of my real life. At work, I went through my days as if nothing had changed, but my phone became my secret world. His messages arrived like warmth in the middle of cold days. He told me things he hadn't told anyone, his regrets, his dreams, his mistakes, and I told him things I'd buried years ago. The more I shared, the lighter I felt, even though I knew what I was doing wasn't right. It wasn't physical, but it was intimate in a way that frightened me. Emotional closeness can be more dangerous than touch. It crosses lines no one sees until they're already behind you. That he told me I deserved more, that I was too kind, too patient, too forgiving. Words like that can make a starving heart believe it's being fed. I told him he was exaggerating, but inside, I wanted to believe him. I started waiting for his messages the way I once waited for my husband's calls. When my phone stayed silent for too long, I felt an ache that scared me. That's when I knew I was already too deep. But addiction doesn't always announce itself, it just becomes routine. I said yes to longer talks, to late-night confessions, to secrets that would sound innocent if spoken aloud but weren't. I told myself boundaries still existed. I told myself I could stop whenever I wanted. Lies sound convincing when they're the only thing keeping your guilt quiet. One evening, he said something simple: I wish we could see each other again. My heart skipped before my conscience could speak. I typed I shouldn't, but deleted it before sending. Instead, I wrote, maybe, someday. He read between the lines, and I didn't correct him. The truth is, I wanted to see him again. Not for anything physical, but because with him, I felt visible. I had forgotten what that felt like. Every yes I gave was disguised as harmless curiosity, but I knew what I was doing. I was feeding an emptiness, one reply at a time. Guilt came in small waves. It wasn't the heavy, punishing kind, it was quiet, almost tender. I'd look at my husband and wonder when I started lying with my eyes. He'd talk about his projects, his deadlines, and I'd nod while my thoughts wandered elsewhere. Sometimes, I caught myself smiling at my phone and quickly hiding it, like a child caught stealing. But what I was stealing wasn't attention, it was validation. He reminded me of who I used to be: warm, interesting, wanted. I began to dress differently, care more about how I looked, not for my husband, but for someone who didn't belong to my world. I knew how fragile it was, how easily it could all collapse. I told myself to stop, to block him, to let the silence return, but I never followed through. Because every time I tried to leave, I'd remember how he made me feel, not young, not reckless, but alive. It's dangerous when someone gives you what you've been craving while you still belong to someone else. It makes you forget the cost of it all. He never pressured me. He didn't have to. I was already giving him the part of me my husband had stopped noticing. The next time he asked if I wanted to meet again, there was no hesitation, no excuse. Just that same word, simple and heavy, carrying everything I didn't say aloud. I said yes. I told myself it would be the last time, just one meeting to close the chapter quietly, to prove I was still in control. But the truth was, I had already lost that control long before I ever saw him again. The moment I agreed, something inside me shifted. a line drawn in sand that I pretended didn't matter. When I met him, everything felt too familiar, too easy, as if my guilt had taken the day off. He looked at me like he already knew what I was trying to hide. I didn't plan to stay long, but time dissolved between words and glances that said too much. The air carried that same tension I'd been trying to deny, something quiet, charged, inevitable. Every thought of right or wrong blurred until nothing made sense except how alive I felt in that moment. For months, I'd been invisible. Now every second felt like proof that I still existed. That he didn't ask for promises or explanations, and I didn't offer any. The world outside could have ended and I wouldn't have noticed. It wasn't the kind of passion you see in movies. It was quieter, more dangerous. It was surrender disguised as relief. I thought about my husband once, just once, and then I stopped because the guilt made my hands shake. I kept telling myself this would fix something inside me, that I deserved to feel again, that a single night couldn't destroy an entire life. But the heart doesn't deal in logic. It trades in moments. And that night, I traded every part of who I thought I was for the feeling of being wanted. That I said yes to everything, not just to him, but to the part of me that had been waiting for someone to see her again. Every word, every touch, every quiet breath felt like a rebellion against years of neglect. It wasn't about love, it was about being remembered. I didn't think about consequences, only the way it felt to finally stop pretending that I was content. Somewhere deep down, I knew this wasn't freedom, it was escape, temporary and cruel. But I chose it anyway. I told myself I could return to normal tomorrow, as if desire could be folded neatly back into silence. When it was over, there was no relief, no victory. Just stillness. The kind that follows storms. He smiled softly, unaware of the weight pressing down on me. I wanted to speak, to explain, to justify, but words failed. Every argument I'd used to defend this moment crumbled the second it became real. I had thought I would feel whole, instead, I felt split open. I tried to tell myself it didn't mean anything, that it was just a mistake, but lies sound hollow when you've already crossed the line. The guilt didn't come crashing down, it seeped in quietly, filling every corner of my mind until breathing felt heavy. On my way home, I rehearsed what I'd say if my husband asked where I'd been, but he didn't. He was asleep, just like every other night. I stood there in the dark, watching him breathe, and for a moment, I hated him for making it so easy to betray him. Then I hated myself for thinking that. I slipped under the covers and stared at the ceiling, the silence louder than ever. Nothing had changed outwardly, no arguments, no discoveries, but everything inside me had shifted beyond repair. I felt his warmth beside me and it only deepened the coldness within. The next morning, he kissed my forehead before leaving for work, something he hadn't done in months. That small gesture broke me more than anything else. It was a reminder that I had destroyed something I'd once prayed to protect. The irony of it burned quietly. The very day he remembered to care was the day I'd given my heart to someone else. I went through the motions, coffee, chores, routine, but everything felt foreign. My reflection looked the same, but the woman staring back wasn't me anymore. She was someone who had said yes when she should have walked away. I told myself I'd end it, that this was the end of everything, but endings aren't that simple. The memory of that night clung to me, not because it was perfect, but because it exposed everything I'd been denying. It wasn't about him, it was about what I had lost long before he came along. I had crossed the line chasing a feeling that should have come from the man I married. And now, even if I wanted to, I couldn't go back to the version of myself that still believed she was blameless. Some choices don't echo, they stay, quietly, shaping the rest of your life. That night, I didn't just say yes to another person. I said yes to a truth I'll never be able to forget. Days passed like unspoken sentences. Amir had started stepping outside more, returning later than usual. Hanya told herself it was work, but the faint smell of perfume on his shirt one evening told her otherwise. It wasn't her mother's fragrance, and it wasn't from home. That small discovery unsettled her more than she could explain. She didn't ask. She just watched. Every time he checked his phone, every faint smile he tried to hide, every pause before answering her simple questions, it all began to feel like quiet betrayal. It wasn't love she wanted from him, not the kind she could name, yet his distance felt like abandonment. Her chest carried a strange ache, one that mixed guilt with jealousy. Soj's visits became more frequent. She came with cooked meals, warm laughter, and stories meant to lighten the house. Amir seemed to welcome her presence. Hanya, however, watched from corners, saying little, answering politely when addressed. When Sadia complimented her, she forced a smile that didn't reach her eyes. She didn't like the sound of her father's laughter when Sadia spoke. It felt borrowed, like something that belonged to another time, another woman. After one such evening, Hanya entered the kitchen to find her father washing dishes alone. His shirt sleeves were rolled up, the tap running softly. He didn't notice her at first. She watched him for a moment, noticing how different he looked, alive, almost happy. She wanted to break that ease, to remind him of what they'd lost. Instead, she said quietly, "She comes here a lot now." He looked up, a bit startled, then nodded. "She's helping," he said simply. The words landed like stones. Helping. She turned away before he could see the expression on her face. That night, sleep refused to come. Her thoughts circled like restless birds. She thought of Sadia's hand brushing her father's arm when she laughed, how naturally he let it happen. She hated herself for caring, hated the way her stomach twisted at the image. She sat by the window again, watching the faint glow from his study. He hadn't turned off the light. She rose, walked down the hall, each step measured, careful. Through the half-open door, she saw him slump in the chair, asleep over open papers. His glasses tilted, his breathing deep. The lamplight fell softly across his face, outlining the tired lines beneath his eyes. For a moment, she only watched him. Then, almost without thought, she moved closer. Her fingers brushed the edge of the desk, then hesitated above his hair. The scent of his cologne mixed with the faint ink smell of the papers. She shouldn't have been there, but the stillness pulled her in. Her hand trembled as she pushed a strand of hair from his forehead. It was a gentle, fleeting gesture, nothing, and yet too much. She stood frozen afterward, her breath shallow, heart loud in the quiet room. Something broke inside her then, quietly, like glass cracking beneath cloth. She turned away before he stirred, before the wrongness could take shape. Morning came heavy. He was quieter than usual, avoiding her gaze. She knew he had sensed something, maybe not fully, but enough. The silence between them grew sharp, dangerous. At breakfast, his hand brushed hers accidentally, and both them froze. He pulled back quickly, clearing his throat, pretending to read the newspaper. She stared at the untouched food, her throat dry. Every word they didn't say pressed against her like a confession waiting to escape. Later that day, she overheard his voice through the half-open door. Sadia had come again. They were talking softly, but one sentence reached her clearly, Amr saying, "Maybe it's time I moved on." The words hit her like a slap. She stepped back, her breath caught. The thought of him starting over, sharing his mornings, his home, with someone else, it twisted her inside out. She didn't know why it hurt so much, only that it did. When Sadia left, the door closed gently, and Amir lingered in the hallway for a while. Hanya was waiting, pretending to dust the shelves. "You like her," she said, her voice too calm. He looked at her, confused by the tone. "She's a friend," he answered. She smiled faintly, though her hands trembled. "Friends don't make you forget who you were," she said, almost whispering. His face hardened. "Enough, Hanya," he said quietly, and walked away. Her eyes burned, not from tears, but from something deeper: rejection, shame, realization. She went to her room and closed the door, the sound of it echoing through the house. The scarf her mother had left on the chair lay there, folded neatly. She picked it up, pressed it to her face, breathing in the faint scent of the past. Then, without thinking, she carried it to the balcony and lit it. The fabric curled, blackened, and turned to ash. The flames reflected in her eyes, flickering with guilt and defiance. She watched the last piece burn out, her voice breaking softly in the wind. "You left him alone for too long." The words weren't meant for anyone, yet they felt like a confession inside. Amir stood in the hallway, looking at the faint glow from the balcony. He didn't move toward it. Maybe he knew, maybe he didn't. The distance between them had become something unfixable, filled with feelings neither could admit. That night, neither of them spoke. The house was utterly still, holding the weight of what neither could name. The air between their rooms felt charged, almost alive, heavy with tension and regret. When Hanya finally closed her eyes, her last thought wasn't of Sadia or her mother, it was of her father's hand on the table that morning, the way it had pulled back from hers, as if touch itself had become dangerous. And that unspoken distance, something inside her broke fully, not with sound, but with surrender.